Tonight, we begin a two-part journey into one of the greatest civilizations the earth has ever witnessed. Egypt, land of the pharaohs. The story of Egypt starts not on the Nile River, but deeper into what is now the Sahara Desert. 7,000 years ago, before the Egyptian dynastic period, the Sahara was more hospitable, but started to change with the shift of the local climate. One area was a lake and was settled by early people in this region. We now call it Nabta Playa. Located approximately 70 miles from the Nile, Nabta Playa was discovered in 1974 and could be a settlement of people who became the Egyptians, but archaeological evidence for sure tells us these people were anything but primitive hunter-gatherers. As climate changed to become more like we see it now, the people living at Nabta Playa probably migrated up to the Nile and helped to form the settlements that eventually became what we now call Upper and Lower Egypt. At Nabta Playa, we already see very early signs of what would become Egypt appearing as the stone structure that was discovered there, sort of a mini desert Stonehenge, predicts the coming rainy season and is essentially one of, if not, the oldest calendar ever found. Also found there were very large stones surrounding large pits, and most notably, these stones are not native to the local area, but had to be transported a long way. This is already sounding like the Egypt we know and adore, as what could be more Egyptian than the transportation and usage of massive stones over long distances, some weighing in at over 1.5 tons. This also shows the level of organization and an already somewhat modern culture has formed as they are able to achieve these things for reasons that seem mostly honorary or spiritual in nature, as these rocks are thought to be marking burial sites of someone like a rain-bringer or other spiritual leader. Also found at Nabta Playa was a very large carved stone. This stone had smooth sides, a nice 90-degree angle, and shows the grooves and chisel marks from being formed as well. The dawn of Egypt, or maybe just early people next door, but either way, these people show all of the signs of the great civilization we will see flourish in what becomes the most celebrated ancient culture in Earth's history, ancient Egypt. (5,000 BC), and the land of the Sahara starts to dry out and become what it is today, the Sahara Desert, and the people migrate towards the Nile River. The Great Nile River, with origins deep in Africa, running over 4,000 miles, makes its way to the Nile Delta, then to the Mediterranean Sea. Flooding its banks each year, the Nile washes nutrient-rich soil, turning what would be very poor farming land into a lush environment for growing crops. But the Nile does not always play nice, and would flood over, causing damages to villages and those living there, or have a very poor flood, causing famine, making the Nile both the lifeblood and a foreboding danger to the people whose lives depended on it. This seems to be the reason the early Egyptians again developed a calendar based on 3 seasons, but this time to predict the coming floods and be ready for whatever they may bring. This is the time when the people who became the Egyptians we know start to properly form a society like we know today, as we see the development of dikes to control the waters from the Nile, wells to provide fresh drinking water, and the rudiments of basic geometry start to surface as they start to mark out their property lines and other areas for the people in what are now becoming what we would all recognize today, towns. 4000 BC. We start to see the true basis of the Egyptian culture start to emerge with examples of beautifully decorated pottery being found in the archaeological record, as well as signs of mixed cosmetics used for the same reasons we use them today, to make us look good. We find flint knives of exceptional quality, some with elaborately carved handles we would appreciate on a store shelf today. These are not the kind of things you discover at the site of a band of hunter-gatherers, and over the span of the next 1,000 years, these settlements and towns came together to form two great kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt. This is truly where the grandeur and splendor of ancient Egypt begins, where the architecture and the awe-inspiring ruins we all love today spring from. The story of Egypt's unification. The crown worn by Pharaoh of Egypt is an amalgamation of the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt, forever cementing, in time, the story of the creation of Earth's first great civilization. Lower Egypt, land of the Nile Delta, and Upper Egypt, land of the Nile Valley, were separate but similar places. Nekhen, or Hierakonpolis, city of the hawk as named by the Greeks, was in Upper Egypt and is likely Egypt's first proper city as we would call it today. Not much more than craters dug by robbers litter the site today, but modern Egyptologists are still learning from the site, as we are finding that by 3500 BC, Hierakonpolis was probably the most important location along the Nile at the time, as we find a variable industrial section of the city with bakeries, breweries, granaries for the storage of food, and more. All of this more than 5,500 years ago. Not bad indeed. Also were found some deep holes, used to hold some massive poles for a temple, the first known temple in Egypt and the prototype of the amazing structures to come. The temple would have been the main structure and focus of the city, and been in view of all surrounding it. Imposing seems to be an Egyptian trait from day one. Enter Bhuto, Upper Egypt's largest city, and a rival to Nekhen. Again in Bhuto, we find traces of pottery similar to we find in Lower Egypt, but of a lower quality than we find in Hierakonpolis. Over time, the record shows that Upper Egypt started to make their pottery in the same style, showing the time when the cultures started to merge. For a time, the story of this merging was murky, but we now think we have a somewhat clear picture, and this picture has a name: King Narmer of Upper Egypt. Manetho, a 3rd century Egyptian historian, called him Menes. The 5th century Greek historian Herodotus referred to him as Men. And 2 native king lists of the 19th dynasty, 13th century BC, call him Mene. Modern scholars have inconclusively, but with some certainty, identified the legendary Menes with one or more of the archaic Egyptian kings bearing the names Scorpion, Narmer, and Ah. Scholars are not in total agreement, but based on the Narmer palette, King Narmer seems to be claiming it was his victory in battle that unified the kingdoms. Some archaeological evidence suggests the kingdoms were partially unified by the time of Ka and Iri-Hor, Narmer's immediate predecessors, and perhaps earlier, but current evidence does lead to a full unification under King Menes. This unification leads us to the next step in our story. Egypt, builders of the greatest structures the world had ever seen. Mastaba, coming from the Arabic word for bench, became the go-to tomb for the more affluent dead in ancient unified Egypt. The mastaba, or pirjet, was the house of eternity and the palace the soul would live in after death. Early mastabas were built using mud bricks, but as time progressed, stone became a material for anyone possessing the wealth to afford it. The mastaba slowly evolved more elaborate places of offerings for the deceased, and carrying on into the pyramid-building era of the pharaohs, the mastaba remained the standard choice for most wealthy Egyptians, as only the pharaoh could arrange the construction of something as grand as a pyramid. As Egyptian culture progressed and evolved, the simple mastaba would prove to be not enough for the pharaohs of the time, and at Saqqara, we find the big step in architecture and construction that evolved into the calling card of ancient Egypt, the stepped pyramid. (2630 BC), and we see things evolve from the mastaba, the traditional up-to-the-point burial structure for kings and noblemen, in what can only be described as monumentous, the stepped pyramid at Saqqara. Truly the grandest structure the world had ever seen up until this point. It began as a mastaba, but then the legendary Imhotep had a grand vision, and what would have been a single-layered structure was turned into what might be called a man-made mountain, as it was the tallest structure in the world upon its completion. Surrounded by a complex of courtyards, temples, and shrines, it must have been the grandest sight to behold, and one that would leave all who visited it with a grand sense of wonder and awe. Imhotep was later deified, and still to this day his name is spoken with respect. Later pharaohs would try and recreate this, but maybe due to their reign not being long enough or other reasons, they were not completed, but Egypt was not done yet, and things were about to get even grander with Pharaoh Seneferu and the pyramids at Dashur. The Red Pyramid, so called due to the color of the stone used in its construction, is the third built by Seneferu, and the first true pyramid built. Even after all the buildings still to come in Egypt, the Red Pyramid is the third tallest built. It shares the more shallow angle used for the top half of the bent pyramid, giving it a slightly more squat look to it when compared to the others built after. Even with its casing stone long gone, the Red Pyramid is a wonder that will stay with all who visit the site. Grand and amazing the Red Pyramid is, but the next step in construction brings us to the only standing wonder of the ancient world, the great king Khufu's pyramid at the Giza Plateau, the greatest structure of the ancient world and still one of the world's most amazing feats of construction. What can be said about this fantastic structure that hasn't been said already? People all through the ages have been taken in by this massive structure, and still to this day, debates go on concerning its construction. Khufu took things to literal new heights with this wondrous monument, and the world has marveled at it ever since. The sides of the base measure 230 meters each, and with an original height of 147 meters, nothing came close to this magnificent structure in its day. Arranged to the cardinal points of the compass, the Great Pyramid shows just how advanced the Egyptians of the time were, as building something like the Great Pyramid takes knowledge and skills in many areas to come together. The inside of the Great Pyramid had some great design work as well. A great example would be above the King's Chamber, as the architects were brilliant in their design. in order to keep the great mass above the king's chamber from collapsing into the chamber itself, they came up with an amazing design. They built in relief chambers above the king's chamber to take the load from the weight above and channel it around the chamber, and to this day, it's still holding up just fine. Tonight we have looked at the building up and growth of Egypt, and we have looked into some of its many splendorous structures. But the people themselves, who were they? How were they? And what were their daily lives like? This will be explored in part 2, along with more, as we take the story forward to its natural conclusion, Cleopatra. So join us next week for part 2 of Egypt on the Pain of Progress.